I think God is moving its tongue. Shove it aside! Hello, it's Mitchell, your new metal voice coach, because today we are taking a look at My Own Summer by Deftones. The singer of Deftones, Chino Moreno, has a really cool, raw voice.
It's raw. It's
And we're going to unpack it today. We're going to take a look at a isolated vocal, and then we're also going to take a look at a live performance. I've been looking forward to making a video on Deftones for a while because they're a band that has pretty unrefined vocals. And I don't say that in a way to cast any shade upon Chino's voice, but it's pretty well known that when it came to screaming, especially in the early years of Chino's career, he kind of just raw dogged it. He's well known to be an artist who has learned how to scream through trial and error, and I think that this is really valuable because I think a lot of people, if not the majority of people that use distortion, have learned it through some sort of trial and error. There are lots of new studies coming to light, and there are lots of new voice coaches that you can work with on these kinds of things, but for a lot of people, historically, it has been a trial and error basis. So if you're somebody that's learning how to scream and you're going through a lot of trial and error, hopefully this video can help you out. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's take a look at the isolated vocal first.
Hey you, big star, tell me when it's over.
Okay, right away, we're hearing a lot of interesting things happening in post. So Chino's vocal is pretty mellow, and if I want to sing this way, I actually have to whisper into the microphone. I have to go, hey you, big star. And that's essentially what he's doing into the microphone. He does have a little bit more fry than I'm having, and we'll go over that in a sec. But I also want you to pay attention to the vocal effect that's happening. Right here, I think there really is only one track of Chino singing, but it's being sent through an effect called a doubler, which essentially doubles the voice. And it also kind of pans it left and right, so it kind of sounds like there's two voices hitting you from each ear instead of one voice down the middle. Let's take a listen to that again.
Big star, tell me when it's over.
Yeah, you kind of hear those two voices. One is a little more prominent than the other, though, so there is a chance that he just recorded a couple tracks and sang over this a couple times. The reason I say it sounds like there's a doubler is because the timing is so clean. Both of the tracks are so perfectly aligned that either he did a really good job taking a couple takes, or he just recorded the one take and it was put into a doubler. We also are hearing some cool reverb, which is creating a tail to the sound. But the majority of the energy and excitement in Chino's voice is coming from a contrast between a breathy sound and a clear sound. You can hear this whispered breathy sound at first.
Star, tell me when it's over.
But when he goes, when it's over, that sounds a little bit more clear as opposed to breathy. Singing with a breathy sound is not something that's always easy to do, so we're going to play around with breathy and clear tones. Lucky for us, Chino uses both, so this exercise that we're going to do is going to be directly relevant to singing in the style of Deftones. So first we need to make a breathy sound. Just go, and then all we have to do is add it onto a pitch. Just like you're sighing. Now, on the other side is a buzzy or clear tone. And if you're somebody that has a hard time getting a clear tone, all you need to do is make a whiny sound. Not like a nasally sound in your nose, but just like a And let's see what happens if we go back and forth between these two. For me, it kind of feels like the sound is traveling back, but that being said, it's not traveling back in the way that the focus or resonance is traveling back. I'm not going, I'm just going, And what's actually happening is that we're letting the voice be a little bit more lazy, and so more air is leaking through. When we sing, our voice rubs together with a necessary amount of closure in the voice, and when we get rid of some of that closure, air is going to leak out and sound breathy. So singing breathy is really cool, but it's also a little bit tricky because all of the air is flowing out. So if you try to sing breathy, you're essentially dumping all of your air out and you're going to run out of breath. So one thing you can do to help make this exercise easier is to find your jellies.
Oh, you feel it. You feel it in your jellies, don't you?
There's nothing in my jellies.
I talked about this in the last video, but find the area right below your sternum or your intercostal muscles by your rib cage and take a normal inhale. Don't do anything special, just take in the air and go, mmm. And if you push your fingers in, you can feel this kind of squeezing, almost like an accordion, and it pushes out right here in your jellies. My sternum's right here, my belly's right here. You can kind of see it. So if we do something like, and then we hold that sensation, and then we do the breathy sound, you might have an easier time with this exercise. So we're gonna find an easy note in your range. For me, it's gonna be down here, like an E. And we're gonna go to breathy, and then we're gonna come back to buzzy. And we're just gonna move up and down. And all the while holding that activation in our jellies. Now, when you breathe, you need to let go. If you're squeezing a little bit here, that's also when you're singing, but you don't want to be squeezing the whole time. You have to let go and restart each time. So it's loose, air just goes in, we don't do any work, we're just letting the air go in. And we're holding this support down here. And instead of going from one to the other, see what happens if you try to like get all of the shades of buzzy to breathy. So, see if you can get all of the nooks and crannies between fully breathy and fully buzzy. Not only is this a great way to explore the extremes of a clear tone versus a breathy tone, but this is also a really good warm-up that is just something that's good to do on a regular basis. What this does is it coordinates your voice in a way where it uses all of the muscles in your voice, and it's a really good way to warm up, especially if you're going to be using mixed voice. We're not going to be doing a ton of high singing necessarily today, but that being said, a lot of the screams we are doing can be paired with mixed voice because they can be pretty hybridized. So there's no harm in doing this on a regular basis, whether you're just a metal vocalist who does extreme vocals or whether you're somebody that does both. You can also switch the order around. So it might be easier to start breathy, go to buzzy, and then back to breathy. Let's try that. Couple more. You get the idea. So you can do this either way, buzzy to buzzy, or breathy to breathy. If you can do this exercise, you can pretty much sing like Chino. You're pretty much 90% of the way there. Again, sometimes he sings with a more focused, less breathy sound, and then sometimes he lets the breathiness happen as well. Now, I think it's also worth noting that he sings like this a little bit less live than he does in the studio. You can get away with a lot of whispering and breathy sounds in the studio, but live it's going to be a lot harder, especially when your body is as involved as Chino's is. He's really jumping up and down a lot. Let's take a look at a live performance here. Watch me guide you to shelter. You can hear that his sound is a lot clearer. In the recording, he really is whispering, but in the live performance, he has a little bit more sound. Now, he also might have an effect on the microphone. I cannot confirm this 100%, but you do hear a little bit of that distorted doubling Doppler-y sound in his voice, and you do hear a little bit of tightness in his voice, which would contradict a little bit of the breathy sound that he uses in the recording. In the recording, it's, hey you, with a little bit of fry. Hey, you. But here he's going shelter with a little bit of a huh. So instead of trying to mimic exactly what he's doing, I think it's worth noting all of the ingredients. So far we have breathy and buzzy, but we also have this huh kind of sound. And similar to what we were talking about with our breath, this huh can be a little bit of a reinforcing sensation when you're singing breathy. I wouldn't recommend singing through a huh all the time and holding things tight all the time. It gets a little bit tiring if you do it too much, and if you push too hard through that sensation, you're definitely going to tire out. But if you're singing breathy and you want to sing quietly and you are having a hard time with control or breathing, you can definitely try a little bit of a summer. It's going to give the sound a little bit of a muffled quality, and it's also going to tighten the sound a little bit. This is going to create a really interesting texture that sounds like you're kind of really holding yourself back, like you're about to explode. And then we also have this fry quality. If you want to have a little bit of fry in your voice when you sing, that's totally okay. For some people, this will happen naturally if you're tired, but for others, you might have to find your fry manually and put it on. To do that, say fa, and slide down. Fa, as low as you can go. It's this creaky doors out. And if you try really hard, you can get rid of your pitch. You can still hear my pitch, but you don't actually need to get rid of your pitch because we're going to be singing with fry anyway. So can you just go fa? We're just going to go back and forth, up and down a little bit. You don't need to go very high, but if you just add this to your warm-up and do it for like a minute every day, you'll have no problem adding some fry on in time. The summer. And the way Chino uses fry is kind of spontaneous. He's not singing with fry the whole time. He's just adding a little bit of that creakiness into his voice. Hey, you, big star, I'm just so angry. I've made a bunch of short form content on Deftones before, and there's another element to his tone that I've talked about, which is straight up just moaning. Like, I'm not trying to be weird and be moaning on the internet for no reason, but it's kinda a great way to get some energy in your voice. I don't know why I always make this face when I do it, but the moaning through that tight sound creates an instability that sounds almost animalistic or demonic. And I think that if you're singing nu metal, you want your voice to sound a little less than human. You want it to sound dark and scary. So if thinking about moaning seems weird to you, you don't have to do it. You can just use these other 4 ingredients. But if you really want to lean into a exciting and dramatic nu metal sound, here are your ingredients. You have your fry, and you turn that on and off. You have your breathy sound, maybe with a little bit of tightness, to create an unstable sound. And then you also have your clear sound, and then you have your little bit of moan too. I think God is moving its tongue. I think there's definitely a section where he says that. Let's find that. I think God is moving its tongue. It's such a luscious sound there. It's tongue. And the delivery for this is different than a lot of singing, because in a lot of other styles of singing or in rock genres, we're not letting our voice break. We're trying to keep the tone clear and consistent. Tongue. But here we want to let the voice do some weird stuff. Tongue. And I don't necessarily think that Chino knew all of this when he was singing. I don't think he thought, I'm gonna squeeze my voice really hard so it breaks apart. I mean, he might have understood his voice that way, and if he did, that's awesome. But this is just something that happens when you put a lot of pressure on your voice. Again, one way to get that pressure is to hold a little bit of a glottal attack. You don't have to go so hard, but do half of that. And you should still sound pretty normal. I'm holding that sensation right now, that little bit of closure in the throat. I think God, when you add the breathiness, is moving. Hear that little bit of wobble in my voice? Moving its tongue. It's not quite vibrato. It's tongue. Whoa, theatrical moment. It's not like that at all. But we are still getting that wiggle or wobble in the voice. And because it's so inconsistent, it has a similar effect to vibrato. It creates excitement, but it creates an unstable excitement. So if you're somebody that wants to create excitement in your voice, but you don't have vibrato yet, this is something you can do. And you don't even need to squeeze your voice. You could just change the shape of your vowels. Tongue. I added a little bit of breathiness in there at the end. Tongue. I created tons of excitement in my voice without going, whoa. I know I didn't spend a lot of time reacting to the vocals, but they're all pretty much the same in this song. Go ahead and read the poetry. It's nice poetry and it does matter. But for the most part, we are just going to be sticking to these tone qualities. With that out of the way, let's move on to the distortion. All right, let's talk about the distortion. Chino Moreno is somebody that is well known as somebody who just goes for it. And I've talked to a lot of people about screaming who say they just go for it. And I think that it might be an unpopular opinion that this is actually okay in a lot of cases. I think it's important to remember that the music that was being made in the 90s by Deftones wasn't necessarily made to be commercially a hit. It ended up being pretty big and pretty popular, but a lot of genres like this with unrefined vocals were just meant to be people expressing what they needed to express. They wanted to make music that was going to be impactful for them, and one way that they could express themselves is to just scream. I don't necessarily think this is wrong. If you're somebody that is a vocalist and you sing in your car and you just go for it and you like how you sound, there's nothing wrong with that. If you feel like you're screaming so much that you can't talk for a few days after, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but it does sound a little uncomfortable, and I'd like to show you some ways that you can make that easier. But if you're in a band and you scream and you lose your voice sometimes, that's okay. The end goal for a lot of people is to have vocals that are sustainable, and it is really fun to learn some of these techniques, like what's known as false chord or fry or hybrid, whatever you call it. Those things are fun to learn, but they're not necessarily required. That being said, when you scream efficiently, it's usually going to sound better. So if you're somebody that likes to talk about this stuff in the comments, I would encourage you not to say that Chino's technique was good or bad, because especially in the 90s, that didn't really exist. We had a lot of people pioneering sounds that we understand a lot better today, but back then, the point of the scream was just to get your message across, and I think it's important to remember that. I'm not saying I think you should trash your voice for your art, but I'm trying to say that we should be understanding of people that do decide to do that, just as much as we should understand people that use their voices in a more efficient way. Now, that being said, I am a vocal coach. I don't want you to feel discomfort, and I don't want you to ruin your voice. So, although open-minded, I'm going to teach you how to scream like this in a couple ways that might be helpful. But first, let's unpack what's going on in both the live version and the recorded version. The recorded version first. Instead of trying to decide whether we think this is fry or false chord or whatever, I think it's important to notice that you can actually hear pitch in these screams. They're high up in Chino's voice. Ah! And even though it doesn't sound like ah, you can hear him going for that pitch. You can hear him shooting for that pitch. So right off the bat, that tells us that there's a hybridized distortion going on. And I think that approaching something like this with that in mind can be freeing because we all have different sets of anatomy. The more I learn about screaming, the more I learn that everybody's instrument is really different, and we already know that about singing, right? People have different ranges, people have different tone qualities, and that's also because of their vocal tract and it being different than everybody else's. But when we start talking about distortion, it's important to remember that not only is our true voice in play, but we have additional tissues in play too. And those tissues are not always directly correlated to the size of your voice. So some people have an easier time rubbing their false chords together than others. Some people have a hard time not rubbing them together. Some people have a hard time not using their arytenoids, while other people have a very hard time using their arytenoids. So instead of trying to categorize this as something that's fry or false chord, it's this, it's that, I think it's actually more beneficial to think about what your body needs to make sounds similar to this. Now, it's interesting because in the context of the full recording of this song with the instruments, the screams sound a lot more brutal, but here they actually sound pretty thin. And I'm not saying that in an insulting way, but just take a look and listen. Listen to how tight this is. Sure, he's screaming, but it doesn't actually sound very loud. I think a lot of the intensity to this section comes from the instrumental underneath in the regular version of this song. When I say thin on those highs, I'm talking about tightness. So when we start tightening our voice in distortion, a lot of pressure builds up below the voice, and the relationship between that pressure and the way the voice is coordinating is what's going to create distortion, which is then amplified by your vocal tract and then sent out into the world. If your voice is so tight that barely any sound is coming through, it's not going to be very loud. And if we have other tension squeezing off our vocal tract, that resonating tube, if we squeeze that off, we're also going to have a quieter sound. So with many screamers who are self-taught, this is a very, very common thing. And actually, I'll go as far to say that even with singers who are learning to scream from coaches, this is still something that's very common. Because some ways that you could approach the scream does require a little bit of a closure or a bit of a different sensation. But Chino's using so much that it's actually not very loud. And that's not me saying it's not effective. This is my way of trying to tell you that just because you squeeze harder doesn't mean the scream will be better. In a lot of cases, it means the scream will be weaker. Now, it doesn't mean that the scream will be worse. It just means that it won't be as loud as you're trying to make it. And that's when you can run into some fatigue, because you suddenly have all this pressure below your voice and you're just pushing, and you're squeezing, and you're not really giving your voice a chance to open up and project in a way that it could. The nature of the squeezing has me wanting to lead more towards fry-ish sounds, because when we do hybridize melodic distortion, there is a little bit of squeezing. So one of the first things that I would recommend doing if you want to do a hybridized sound like this is to condition your falsetto to operate freely. I want you to be able to make high, heady, light sounds without squeezing in your neck. If you can sing this without feeling like you're pushing, and without feeling tightening in your neck, then you're in pretty good shape to start working on these screams. If that's something that is harder for you, I would highly recommend learning how to lighten up your voice, whether it be taking a course, or whether it be working with a teacher, that's the best thing you can do, or just seeing what you can find online and trying to lighten that up. But regardless, let's warm up our falsetto. We're gonna do goo, and we're only gonna leave room for a single noodle of spaghetti in our lips.
I did not order a single noodle of spaghetti.
My challenge for you is to make this as quiet as possible. You can take your time sliding up and down. We went high, now let's make sure we go all the way down until we can't go anymore. You can follow along or skip ahead. great. The reason I want you to condition or coordinate your falsetto in this way is because hybridized fry distortion feels very similar to falsetto. Now, oftentimes we're not just using falsetto with fry. We're not just going, ah, but the way that the falsetto tends to feel in your head as opposed to your chest lends itself very nicely to this kind of distortion. Now, I'm gonna show you a way in which you can have a more robust sound than Chino, but that being said, if you learn this and you're not pleased with the sound, it doesn't sound close enough to you, you can just add a little bit more compression on. But I think it's better to learn more loose first, because you can always squeeze, as opposed to starting from squeezed and then having to learn how to let go. That can be a little bit complicated in my experience. Also, a disclaimer, even though I'm talking about fry-based sounds, there's a very good chance that my false chords are gonna activate, and maybe even some additional tissue. If you're new to my channel, I use terms like fry and false chord to describe sounds rather than the specific vocal function. Because a lot is happening in our voice, and unless we're directly scoping things, there's no real use trying to say exactly what's happening. Let's just describe the sounds we're making. Step one to making this fryish scream. First, we need to go like this. And we want to do this a little bit higher. Now, if that's too high, you can drop it a little bit. Having a little bit of a whiny quality can be really helpful to getting the sensation up here. We want to avoid feeling everything in our neck and chest. If you feel like everything's stuck here, see what you can do to relax your throat. It might just be a tongue and a jaw thing. You might want to wiggle your head around. But it's really important that you're free up to this point. Once we have our we can play around with a little bit of that closure. Remember our glottal attack from before? But instead of things being totally closed, let's open it up a little bit. So let's go from open to closed. And see how slowly you can go from open to closed. This is the really, really important part, because we want to unlock as much of that gray area in between open and closed as possible. This is what's going to give these kinds of screams more color. There we go. You heard like 3 or 4 different main qualities. Let's stick to those second or third one. And let's do Now you might already hear a little bit of fry in my voice, because either A, I'm tired, or I've been doing a lot of fry screaming and my voice just wants to be fry right now. But if your voice isn't having any fry, just add a little bit of that sensation. Now with your pitch, let's bring it up a little bit. On that last one, I actually felt like I had a lot of pressure underneath. If you feel like there's a lot of pressure building up in your neck, one of 2 things is happening. You're either squeezing too hard or you're giving too much air. Remember, the tighter the position, the more of that pressure buildup. And if you feel a lot of that pressure buildup, that's either going to lead to a scream that's uncomfortable or a scream that just doesn't work. Again, when you're playing around with this, it's normal to feel a little bit of discomfort here and there. It's also normal for things to just not work. That doesn't mean you're doing things wrong. You're just exploring. And learning how to do this stuff takes time. So let's go back to our Let's add a little bit more of a streamlined sound. I'm not saying sing harder, just clearer. Now, if nothing's happening and you feel like things are just tightening a lot, try yodeling through it. For a lot of people, this is how they find their fry scream. But if you're not a big yodeler or it's not working, you can go back to the first thing we were trying. Now, I totally feel some fry sensation, but I also feel a little bit of like a sensation, which definitely means my false chords are involved. That being said, this sounds like fry. Let's see if we can find that note. Shove! 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 Even though my false chords may be at play here, this feels a lot different than shove, which again is also a fine way to go for this scream. A high false chord scream and a hybridized fry scream sound almost identical. Now, if we want to thin out the sound a little bit more, we establish this sound, and then we just add a little bit more of a it has a little bit less body. You might be wondering, Mitchell, why would I want a scream that's less powerful? One answer I could think about is if you want your music to sound more painful. I don't really endorse people experiencing pain to sing or scream, but I totally endorse the idea of wanting people to feel the pain that you're in. So you don't have to hurt. You should still learn how to scream efficiently without discomfort and without the potential for injury. But if you want people to hear a scream that sounds a little bit more desperate and a little bit less refined, it's totally okay to do this every once in a while, especially in the studio. Now, if this is something that's hard for you, you can also do a false chord scream, and I'm just going to do a quick crash course on that. I talk about this a lot, so I am going to move kind of fast. If you get lost or you're confused, I have a whole course on this, I teach this, and there are a lot of people that teach this on the internet too who know what they're doing as well. So if you get confused and you want to go down this rabbit hole, definitely feel free to check that stuff out as well. I'm going to go through some steps on how you can get this false chordy sound. The first thing we need is a false chord rumble. When I do this sound, and I make it a little bit more gentle, there's some rumbling happening in the neck that doesn't happen when I go, and making this sound can actually activate more than just the false chords. It can also activate the arytenoids, which is more of a, that kind of sound. And those aren't wrong to use, but we don't actually need them, especially for these higher sounds. My goal for you is to be able to make this sound as consistently and gently as possible on a pitch. You can do false chord screams without pitch too, but since we're talking about Chino Moreno and he's a singer, let's stick with the pitched one. You may be able to do this right now, but realistically, it's gonna take at least a week or two of doing this regularly to be able to move to the next step efficiently. Learning how to scream is not something you're gonna knock out in one afternoon. You may be able to follow along and make some of these sounds and maybe even make your first scream, but with the research that we have on motor learning, it's more likely that this is going to take you at least 2 months to be able to do consistently, and then many, many more months after that to be able to perfect. So don't be hard on yourself if you try this and you can't figure it out. Step 1 is our Step 2 is to take that sound and pull it back and down. When you're learning how to do this, it's very common that you'll start coughing or you might feel some tickling in your throat. If you feel discomfort here, just take a break and try again later. Up until this point, there's no closure in the voice. Things are completely open. And in pure metal screaming, things will stay pretty open. But when you start adding pitch on and there's hybridization, there is going to be a little bit more closure in the voice. So it's normal if you feel a little bit of squeezing, similar to the compression that we were using in Fry before. After you do this, see if you can go between a pitch sound and this sound. ah, 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 Now, see if you can let your voice crack into this sound. Ah, 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 ah. If you hold on to that throat singing sound as you start to crack upwards, you're gonna start to hear a little bit of a baby scream. Ah, ah, and if you hold on to it, suddenly you have this really cool hybridized false chord scream. Now, if we start bringing this higher and higher, shove it, shove it, shove it aside. We also get a sound that is pretty similar to the Chino Moreno sound. Again, I don't think that Chino used either of these strategies specifically to find his scream, but what he's doing and what I'm doing are probably pretty similar. And even though they may not be exactly the same, they sound close enough to me. You can even combine that first scream that we did with the second one. The shove it aside into one big mega scream. Once you have any of these sounds, all you have to do is play around with your mouth shape. Smaller, more focused mouth shapes are going to give you lower sounds, whereas bigger mouth shapes are going to give you higher sounds. If you want to take this sound and make it lower, just don't shoot as high. I'm getting a little bit carried away here, but there are so many different ways to change the sound once you have it. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm only worried about two things. I'm worried about you being happy with your sound, and I'm worried about you feeling comfortable with how strenuous the sound is. One thing I do want you to know is that if you're playing with these sounds and you're feeling discomfort and you like the sound, but it's a little bit uncomfortable, and you push past that discomfort and you keep doing it even though it hurts or it doesn't feel good, your risk for a vocal injury goes up significantly. So this isn't something I would recommend, even though I can understand why some people choose to scream this way. I know I've talked a lot about the theory behind what's safe and what isn't safe and why we should care, but I think that this video was a perfect time to do that because this music originates from a time where the people that were doing these screams didn't have the information we have today, and so a lot of them probably didn't care. Even though they wanted to perform, they were kind of willing to do whatever it took to make the sounds that they needed to make. And I think that's also what makes the music from this time period so special. It's not perfect, the technique isn't perfect, but people don't really care about that. And that's something to remember. If you want to make music, don't wait until you're a perfect singer, because people are going to like the imperfections they hear as long as they can tell you're being authentic. I know I didn't do a whole lot of reacting to the video itself, so if that's something you were wanting more of, let me know. If you like the style where I don't really cover a ton of the song and I'm just diving into technique, let me know as well. I want to make these videos as entertaining for you as possible. With that, I'll talk to you guys next time.